"Did you get that ink from a gumball machine, Grandpa?" The voice sliced through the morning quiet of Murphy's Diner like a razor. Robert Johnson, 81, kept his weathered hands steady around his coffee mug as the wall of muscle loomed over his booth. The young operator's cold eyes locked onto the faded marking on Robert's sun-spotted forearm. A coiled serpent devouring its own tail. A solitary star trapped within the circle. Davis pressed his scarred knuckles against the cracked vinyl table. "I'm talking to you, old man." His partner shifted uncomfortably beside him, but Davis was just getting started. The tattoo looked more like a prison mistake than military ink. Thick lines blurred by decades of wear. Robert's pale blue eyes remained focused on stirring sugar into his coffee. "It's just something from long ago." "Long ago?" Davis's voice dripped mockery. "What were you, mess hall duty? Kitchen patrol in some safe zone?" The diner fell dead silent. Linda, the waitress, froze mid-pour. Regular customers who knew Robert as the quiet gentleman who always asked about their families watched in growing horror. Then Davis made his fatal error. He reached down and flicked the sacred tattoo with his finger. "Before we continue, if you've ever been dismissed because of your appearance, type honor below and tell me where you're watching from." This story of Robert Johnson proves that true warriors walk among us unseen. I read every comment. The touch sent Robert's mind spiraling backward through time. Murphy's Diner vanished, replaced by the suffocating humidity of triple canopy jungle. He wasn't 81 anymore. He was 24, crouched in elephant grass that cut like razor wire, watching 3 enemy battalions close in on their position. "Stay with me, Johnson," came a whispered voice. Second Lieutenant James Anderson, bleeding from shrapnel wounds, gripped Robert's shoulder with a hand slick with mud and blood. "We're all going home." That tattoo wasn't decoration. It was carved with a bamboo needle and gunpowder ink in a hidden camp deep in the mountains of Laos, marking the 5 survivors of a mission that officially never happened. Project Blackwater. Before Delta Force existed, before SEAL Team 6 was even a concept, there were 5 men who wrote the original playbook for modern special operations in their own blood. Robert blinked. The jungle faded. He was back in the worn vinyl booth, Davis's finger still touching the sacred mark. "You know what I think?" Davis leaned closer, his breath reeking of coffee and arrogance. "I think you're a fake. That ink screams stolen valor to me, Pops." Martinez, the second operator, finally found his voice. "Davis, back off. Man's just having breakfast." "No way." Davis's focus was laser-locked on Robert's weathered face. "I've memorized every unit patch, every campaign ribbon, every legitimate military tattoo in the database. This," he gestured dismissively at the faded ink, "this is backyard garbage. Probably got it done to impress some bar girl back in the day." The psychological assault was surgical, calculated. Davis was Delta Force, trained to break enemies mentally before ever drawing a weapon. To him, this fragile old man was just another target, another weakness to exploit for his own amusement. But what Davis didn't know was that 18 miles away, a phone call was already in motion that would change his life forever. The attack intensified. Davis had found what he believed was easy prey, and like all predators, he pressed his advantage without mercy. "You know what really burns me up?" Davis's voice carried across Murphy's Diner, ensuring every customer became an unwilling witness to the humiliation. It's frauds like you who cheapen what real warriors sacrifice. From behind the counter, Linda Brown had heard enough. Robert Johnson had been coming to Murphy's for 7 years. He never spoke about military service, never claimed to be anything other than a quiet retiree who minded his own business. But watching this persecution ignited something protective in her. She slipped into the tiny office behind the grill, her hands shaking as she dialed her cousin Amy at Fort Liberty headquarters. The phone crackled to life. General Anderson's office, Sergeant Wilson speaking. "Amy, it's Linda," she whispered urgently. "I need help. 2 of your soldiers are here tearing apart one of my regulars." "Linda, if there's trouble, call the—" "His name is Robert Johnson," Linda interrupted. "They're mocking a tattoo on his arm. A snake eating its tail with a star inside." The silence on the other end stretched for what felt like eternity. "Describe it again." Amy's voice had transformed completely. Professional composure replaced by barely controlled alarm. "A serpent in a circle, swallowing its own tail, with a 5-pointed star in the center. The man's name is Robert Johnson." "Sweet Jesus," Amy breathed. "Keep them there. Whatever you have to do, don't let them leave." Back in the main dining area, the psychological torture was escalating. Davis had found his rhythm, feeding off the growing discomfort of the watching customers. "Tell you what, Grandpa," Davis said, sliding uninvited into the booth across from Robert. "Since you're obviously confused about military standards, why don't you educate everyone here about stolen valor?" Martinez grabbed his partner's shoulder. "That's enough, Davis." "Hell no, it's not enough," Davis snapped back. "This is exactly the kind of garbage that dishonors every real operator who's bled for this country." He pointed at Robert's tattoo again. "That marking doesn't exist in any official registry. Trust me, I've checked every database." An elderly man at the counter cleared his throat. "Leave him alone, son." Davis whirled on the stranger. "And who are you? Another wannabe hero?" The venom in his voice silenced any further protest. From her corner booth, Mrs. Garcia, a regular who'd known Robert for years, watched with growing horror. She'd seen Robert help veterans at the VA hospital when her husband was dying. She'd watched him sit quietly with grieving families, never saying a word, just being present. "You see this, people?" Davis addressed the entire diner, his voice carrying command authority. "This is what happens when people fake their way into respect they never earned." But Robert Johnson didn't break. He sat with military bearing, his hands steady, looking not at his tormentor, but through him, seeing something far beyond the walls of Murphy's diner. In his mind, he was back in that mountain camp in Laos. 5 men, the last survivors of Operation Blackwater, huddled around a small fire. Young Lieutenant Anderson, his arm in a crude sling from shrapnel that should have killed him. The names of 18 dead soldiers scrolled through Robert's memory like a memorial wall. Every face, every voice, every sacrifice. That's when the rumble of heavy engines reached them. What nobody knew was that 20 miles away, a 4-star general had just canceled the rest of his day. The convoy arrived like divine intervention. 3 black Chevy Suburbans, government plates gleaming, executed a perfect tactical formation around Murphy's diner. Before the vehicles stopped moving, doors flew open and figures in razor-sharp dress uniforms emerged. Davis and Martinez froze. The casual arrogance drained from Davis's face like water from a broken dam. "What the hell?" Martinez whispered, his voice barely audible. "Why is J-Sock here?" Through the diner's windows, they could see the command security detail, battle-hardened sergeants, major, and master sergeants, moving with choreographed precision. These weren't regular military police. These were the elite protectors of America's highest-level special operations commanders. Robert Johnson remained motionless in his booth, but something had shifted in his demeanor. The patient stillness was still there, but underneath, Linda could detect the faintest hint of recognition. The rear door of the lead Suburban opened. A man stepped out whose mere presence seemed to alter the atmospheric pressure of the entire parking lot. 4 silver stars blazed on his collar, and his expression was set in controlled fury that would have made hardened terrorists reconsider their life choices. General James Anderson, Supreme Commander of U.S. Special Operations Forces. "Oh God," Davis breathed, all color draining from his face. "Oh Christ, what did we step in?" The general strode toward the diner with the measured pace of a man who had toppled governments with his bare hands. His security detail fell in behind him, creating a perimeter that transformed the simple roadside eatery into a classified facility. Inside Murphy's diner, the tension was crushing. Every patron sat, paralyzed, sensing they were witnessing something far beyond their comprehension. The waitresses stopped moving. Even the cook in back went silent. Linda emerged from the kitchen, hands trembling. She caught Robert's eye and mouthed, "I'm sorry." She wasn't sure if she'd just saved him or condemned him to something worse. But Robert Johnson, for the first time since the confrontation began, smiled. A small, sad smile carrying decades of weight. "It's all right, Linda," he said quietly. It was time. The bell above Murphy's door chimed softly as General Anderson entered. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the suffocating silence. He filled the doorway, his presence immediately commanding every square inch of space. His eyes swept the room with tactical precision, assessing the scene with skills honed through 30 years of warfare. They found the 2 Delta operators first. Davis still seated across from Robert, Martinez backing slowly toward the wall. But then his gaze found Robert Johnson. The transformation was immediate and profound. The cold fury in the general's eyes changed into something else entirely. Recognition, respect, and an emotion that looked disturbingly close to reverence. He walked directly to Robert's booth, his polished shoes clicking against worn linoleum. Davis still had his hand extended from his earlier gesture, frozen mid-motion. The general's eyes flicked to that hand, and the look he gave Davis was toxic enough to kill a charging bull. Davis jerked his hand back as if scalded. Then, General Anderson did something that shattered every expectation, every protocol, every assumption about military hierarchy. He snapped to attention and rendered a perfect salute to the frail old man in the booth. What happened next would redefine everything they thought they knew about heroism. General Anderson's salute held for 10 eternal seconds before he slowly lowered his hand. His voice, when he finally spoke, was thick with emotion none of them had ever heard from him. "Robert," he said, "it's been too long, my friend." Robert looked up at him, that same sad smile touching his lips. "Jimmy," he replied, his voice still that quiet rasp. "You got tall." The general allowed himself a brief, grim smile. "We both survived." Then he turned to Davis and Martinez. who looked like they were witnessing their own execution. The Arctic cold returned to his eyes, amplified by righteous fury. "You questioned this man's service," he said, voice low and lethal. Davis could only produce a strangled choking sound. With deliberate ceremonial precision, General Anderson unbuttoned his right sleeve. He rolled it up past his wrist, past an expensive military watch, past scars that told their own stories. There, on the general's forearm, was an identical tattoo. The serpent eating its tail, the five-pointed star. His was newer, lines crisper, but an exact match to Robert's faded ink. A collective gasp swept through Murphy's diner. Linda's hand flew to her mouth. Mrs. Garcia leaned forward, understanding dawning in her eyes. "Let me tell you exactly who you were speaking to," the general announced, his voice carrying to every corner. "This is Robert Johnson. Before Delta Force existed, before SEAL Team 6 was conceived, before any unit you know was formed, there were 5 men sent into darkness to do the impossible." He paused, letting the weight settle. They called it Project Blackwater. 5 volunteers for a mission so classified that most records remain blacked out 50 years later. Deep penetration into Laos to eliminate a North Vietnamese command structure coordinating attacks across 3 countries. Davis and Martinez stood paralyzed, understanding hitting them like physical blows. The mission was compromised on day 2. The general continued. They were hunted by 3 full battalions, over 2,000 enemy soldiers. For 23 days, they ran and fought through hell itself. Robert remained motionless, but his pale eyes had taken on that distant quality, seeing jungle trails again. On day 20, I was Second Lieutenant Anderson, fresh from West Point, and I triggered a bouncing Betty. Shrapnel destroyed my shoulder. I was unconscious, bleeding out, dead weight to the team. The general's voice grew quieter, forcing everyone to strain forward. Protocol was clear. Abandon wounded who couldn't keep pace. Mission took priority over individual lives. But Sergeant Robert Johnson made a different choice. He looked at Robert with profound reverence. For 4 days and 3 nights, this man carried me on his back through swamps, over mountains, past enemy patrols that came within yards of killing us all. He gave me his water when fever took me. He cleaned infected wounds with his bare hands. He never once suggested leaving me behind. Linda found herself crying. Around the diner, hardened customers wiped their eyes. Of 5 men who entered Laos, we were the only survivors. Robert Johnson made sure I was one of them. The reckoning was about to begin. When we reached the extraction zone, General Anderson continued, his voice growing stronger. We were 2 broken men who had witnessed horrors that would haunt most people forever. We had lost brothers, friends, soldiers we would have died for. He stepped closer to Robert's booth. We made a sacred pact. We marked ourselves with this symbol, not as decoration or bragging rights, but as a blood oath, a promise to remember the 3 who didn't make it home, a promise to honor their sacrifice by living lives worthy of their deaths. Davis looked like he was about to vomit. Martinez had gone paper white. The serpent eating its tail, the endless nature of our war, the circle of brotherhood that death cannot break, the 5-pointed star, originally 5 of us, scattered across a dark sky but connected by something stronger than time or distance. Robert finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. Harrison, Kelly, and Brooks. We carry their names. Always, the general agreed. Of the original 5, only we remain. The silence was deafening. Every person in Murphy's Diner understood they were in the presence of living legends they never knew existed. This man, General Anderson said, his gaze burning into Davis, taught me everything about leadership, sacrifice, and service to something greater than yourself. Every strategy I've employed, every life I've saved in 30 years of command, I learned from him. He straightened to his full imposing height. You want to talk about stolen valor? Let me show you what earned valor looks like. The general's voice rose, carrying the authority of absolute command. For 40 years, while you were building careers and collecting medals, Robert Johnson worked as a custodian at the VA Medical Center. Every single day, he quietly served veterans who came after him, cleaning rooms, listening to stories, helping broken warriors through their darkest moments. Sarah gasped. She'd always wondered how Robert afforded those generous tips. He never mentioned Project Blackwater, never sought recognition or benefits, never used his record for personal gain. He just served, quietly, humbly, because that's what genuine soldiers do. The general's voice dropped to a whisper, somehow louder than shouting. And you mocked him, questioned his honor, treated an American hero like trash because he didn't match your narrow definition of military service. Davis was openly weeping now, his tough guy facade completely shattered. Sir, please, if there's any way to make this right. There is, the general said coldly. Report to my office, EO 800 tomorrow. Bring your credentials. Your time in special operations ends today. The career-killing pronouncement hung in the air like a death sentence. But then Robert Johnson did something that surprised everyone. He slowly pushed himself from the booth, standing on unsteady legs, and placed a weathered hand on the general's arm. Jimmy, he said quietly. That's enough. The general turned, confused. Robert, after what I said enough. Something in Robert's voice, not anger or vindictiveness, but deep, abiding wisdom earned through decades of carrying others' burdens. What he said next would define the true measure of heroism. Robert Johnson looked directly into Davis's tear-filled eyes. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of a man who had earned the right to judge character through fire and blood. Son, he said, the tattoo doesn't make the warrior. The warrior gives the tattoo meaning. He gestured gently toward the general, the security detail, the stunned faces surrounding them. All of this, the uniforms, the ranks, the recognition, it comes and goes like seasons. But your character? That's the only thing you truly own. Try not to lose it. Davis collapsed into the booth, sobbing openly. Mr. Johnson, I'm so sorry. What I said, what I did, there's no excuse. No, Robert agreed simply. There isn't. But there is tomorrow. Martinez stepped forward, his own eyes wet with shame. Sir, we dishonored everything we're supposed to represent. Robert studied both young men for a long moment. You dishonored yourselves. The question is, what are you going to do about it? General Anderson watched this exchange with growing amazement. Even in this moment of vindication, Robert was teaching, showing these broken operators what grace looked like. Jimmy, Robert said, turning to his old friend, these boys made a mistake, a big one, but they're young enough to learn from it. The general's expression remained thunderous. Robert, they humiliated you in public, and now they know better? Robert's voice was gentle but firm. "The mission isn't punishment, it's education. Maybe they can teach the next generation to do better." What happened next stunned everyone in Murphy's Diner. General Anderson, the most powerful special operations commander in America, looked at his old friend with profound respect and slowly nodded. "You're right. As always." He turned to Davis and Martinez. "Report to my office tomorrow, but not to surrender your credentials. You're being reassigned to our new legacy program, working directly with veterans like Robert to educate incoming operators about the history and traditions they're inheriting." Davis looked up through his tears. "Sir, consider it penance," the general said. "For the next year, your job will be serving the men you failed to respect. Learn from them. Listen to their stories. Understand what real service looks like." Robert squeezed the general's shoulder. "Thank you, Jimmy." "For what?" "For becoming the leader I knew you could be." As the security detail began to withdraw, Linda approached cautiously. "Mr. Johnson, your breakfast is getting cold." Robert chuckled, the first genuine laughter he'd shown all morning. "Then I better eat it. Jimmy, you buying?" General Anderson grinned, and for a moment, he looked like that young lieutenant again. "Always." As they settled back into the booth, Davis and Martinez stood nearby, uncertain. "Well," Robert asked them, "you boys hungry? Best pancakes in the county." It was a small gesture, but in that moment, it represented everything about grace, forgiveness, and the true meaning of honor. The healing had begun. 6 months later, the legacy program had become the most sought-after assignment in special operations. Davis and Martinez, transformed by their daily interactions with genuine heroes, had become its most passionate advocates. "Tell them about the bamboo needle," Davis would say to Robert during the monthly orientation sessions, his voice filled with reverence instead of the old arrogance. The program wasn't just about education. It was about connection. Young operators learned that their techniques, their equipment, their very culture of excellence had been purchased with blood decades before they were born. Robert Johnson, who had spent 40 years in anonymity, found himself reluctantly famous within the special operations community. But he handled recognition the same way he'd handled obscurity, with quiet dignity and an absolute focus on serving others. "The mission isn't about us," he would tell each new class. "It's about the men who didn't make it home. We're just carrying their torch forward." General Anderson established the Robert Johnson Center for Military Heritage at Fort Liberty. Not because Robert wanted recognition, but because the general understood that some stories were too important to remain in shadows. One morning, a year after the incident at Murphy's Diner, Davis found Robert in his usual booth. But this time, Davis wasn't there to intimidate or mock. He sat down respectfully and pulled up his sleeve. There, fresh and proud on his forearm, was a new tattoo. Not the serpent and star. That belonged to Project Blackwater survivors. But something else. A simple inscription. Harrison, Kelly, Brooks, remembered. "I hope this is okay," Davis said quietly. "I wanted to carry their names too." Robert studied the tattoo for a long moment, then looked into Davis's eyes. What he saw there was genuine transformation. Arrogance replaced by humility. Cruelty replaced by compassion. "They would be honored," Robert said simply. Linda approached with fresh coffee, smiling at the unlikely friendship that had emerged from that terrible morning. "The usual, Mr. Johnson." "Make it 2, Robert said. "My friend here needs some breakfast." As they sat together, the old warrior and the young operator he'd helped remake, Robert reflected on the strange paths that life takes. He'd survived jungle warfare, decades of anonymity, and a moment of public humiliation, only to find purpose in teaching the next generation. The serpent eating its tail. The endless circle. The mission that never truly ends. "Mr. Johnson," Davis asked, "what would you tell someone who's facing their worst moment, when everything seems lost?" Robert smiled, thinking of a young lieutenant bleeding in a jungle 50 years ago. "I'd tell them what I learned in Laos. Nobody fights alone. Not on my watch. Not ever." Outside Murphy's diner, the morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows that gradually shortened and disappeared. But some shadows, the shadows of heroes, never fade. They just pass from one generation to the next, carried forward by those who understand that freedom isn't free and honor isn't given. It's earned every single day. To everyone who typed honor and shared where you're watching from, thank you for standing with our heroes. Subscribe for more stories like this. See you in the next one.